We are moving on to the ecological level of the community. So recall that a community refers to all of the different species in an area. All the populations of different species together make up a community. Now, previously we talked about how individual organisms interact with the environment and the interactions between members of a population. Now we have the possibility of interactions between different species in a community, right? So the number of possible topics we could talk about starts to mushroom. So I've selected just a few particularly important community level ideas. The first one is niche or niche. So it's one of these ideas that is hard to quantify but really important. So one way of thinking about niche is the role that a species occupies in a community. That is perhaps kind of an anthropomorphic way of thinking about it. People think about their niche in society, or your niche might be defined by your job, right? So you can kind of think each species has a job or a role. I guess that's okay. Here's another way, though, of thinking about niche, and that would be define it according to what is the suite of resources that's utilized by the species, right? So in an environment, there are lots of resources available, and different species are utilizing a certain complement of those resources. So together, that defines their niche. Some ecologists would agree that it makes sense to talk about niche width, right? How wide is an organism's niche, right? So the most simplistic way of thinking about that is to classify organisms as being specialists or generalists, depending on what is the suite of resources they use. Do they use a very narrow suite? If so, they're a specialist. Do they use a broad suite of resources? If so, they are a generalist. So here's a medium-sized mammal that we would definitely classify as a generalist, the raccoon, right? They're equally at home in wild places, in the woods, or in urban settings. They call them trash pandas for a reason, right? They're crafty little devils, right? So definitely they have a wide niche. They can make use of lots of different kinds of resources. Here's a medium-sized mammal that is very much a specialist, a sea otter, right? They're very picky about what they eat. They eat a few different kinds of marine invertebrates, abalones, and urchins. They live in kelp forests, right? So these dense stands of brown algae in the ocean. There we have a good example of a specialist. Here are two crustaceans. They're both what we would call amphipods. One of them is a generalist and is so abundant that you can buy them freeze-dried by the pound to feed your fancy tropical aquarium fish. The other one has such a narrow niche that it only lives in one tiny little place in the whole world, and that place is southwestern Illinois. That is the Illinois cave amphipod. It is adapted to cave environments and is restricted to a very small number of caves. That is very much a specialist. So if you have two species whose niches overlap if they're adapted to utilizing the same kinds of resources. And you put those two species together in one habitat, they will experience intense competition. And what will happen is one species will outcompete the other. This is what we refer to as competitive exclusion, right? The idea that two species cannot occupy the same niche in the same habitat. A textbook example, literally here, of competitive exclusion happens with these two barnacle species, or their genera, Calamus and Balanus. Barnacles are crustaceans. If there was only one of the two forms present, they would populate the surface of rocks over the entire tidal zone. But when you put the two together, there are small differences in their niches, so that the Calamus barnacle is a little better at utilizing high tide zones, and the Balanus is a little better at utilizing low tide zones, so they exclude each other, right? They outcompete each other where they have an advantage, and you can't have two species occupying exactly the same niche in the same habitat. What can happen through competition is over time, over generations, the two species can become more different from each other. This is called character displacement. And when characters are displaced, it is as if the species are partitioning the resources, right? Resource partitioning. So these are ground finches, birds that live in the Galapagos. We have two related ground finches here, Geofortis fugilinosa and Geofortis fortis. And the first two graphs are showing the similarity in beak dimensions on two different islands where Los Hermanos, only Fugilinosa lives there. Daphne Major, only Fortis lives there. But on San Cristobal, both species live. And on the islands where they both are found, over time they have become more different from each other. We've had character displacement. Character displacement basically is directional selection. If we go back to natural selection, remember we had directional selection where the two species are moving away from each other, right? So where they overlap, those individuals in both species are experiencing the most competition and having the least reproductive success. But within each species, the individuals adapted to utilizing the parts of the environment that are underutilized by the other are favored, and they move away from each other. They become more different. That's character displacement. That is resource partitioning. These are warblers, right? And they all live in the same pine forest, but they feed and nest in different parts of the trees. Over time, they have become different from each other, and they have partitioned the resources in that environment. Yet another example. These are anole lizards that live in the Caribbean islands. And on each of the major islands like Cuba and Jamaica, there are three or four different anole species that have diverged and take advantage of different kinds of habitat on the same island. Within a community, some species have a particularly large impact. One such example would be what we call a keystone species. Keystone is an architectural term. If you're building an archway out of stones, At the top of the arch, the stone that is keeping the whole arch intact is the keystone. So a keystone species would be one that exerts a strong influence on the ecosystem, not because it's the most abundant, but because it has a critical role, a crucial niche. Your book provides a case study of a sea star that lives in this intertidal marine community, where if you remove that sea star from the community, diversity drops because starfishes, sea stars, are predators, and this species preys on mussels that would otherwise come to colonize the entire surface and prevent other species from existing. So that's an example of a keystone species. Another category of species that has a large impact are ones we call ecosystem engineers. These are species that make physical alterations to the ecosystem. So beavers, by making dams, change the whole structure of a stream and create new habitats that can increase diversity overall. Another level of interaction within a community can be when two species are living together, symbiosis, right? So symbioses evolve over time. They involve at least two species. The host generally is larger, and the symbiont lives in or on or with the host. We can classify symbioses according to what is the benefit or perhaps the detriment to the host by the presence of the symbiont. What you probably think of when you hear symbiosis is mutualism, and that would be a relationship where both the host and the symbiont benefit. However, there are other relationships where the symbiont gains some benefit through the relationship, but it is neutral from the host perspective. The host species is not harmed, nor is it helped by the presence of the symbiont. The third category is parasitism. That is where the presence of the symbiont negatively impacts the host, right? In all of these examples, the symbiont benefits some way. The question is, what impact does that have on the host? Here are three examples of symbioses. At the top, we have ants and aphids. Bottom left, we have a clownfish in a sea anemone. Bottom right, we have a cuckoo chick in a nest and a reed warbler mama. So, one of these is mutualism, one is commensalism, one is parasitism. The mutualistic example are the ants and the aphids. As aphids are feeding on the plant's phloem, they feed and feed and feed until their gut fills with sugary sap and it starts oozing out the other end, and the ants feed on that, right? And in return, the ants protect the aphids. I think I talked about it a little bit in a previous presentation. The commensalism example is the clownfish and the anemone. So the clownfish is the symbiont. It is gaining protection by living amongst the stinging tentacles of that cnidarian, but the mucus coating on the clownfish prevents it from triggering the cnidocysts, and it does not get stung. There's no evidence that the anemone benefits in any way, nor is it harmed. The parasitic example are the birds. Cuckoos lay their eggs in the nests of other birds and abandon them, and they leave the host bird to hatch and rear their chicks. Most birds aren't very good at counting, so if the female leaves to find some food and comes back and there's an extra egg in her nest, she's usually not any wiser for it. So these brood parasites rely on other species to rear their young. Here's one more example of a symbiosis. This is a clutch of spotted salamander eggs that I found a few years ago. And you notice the green, right? There's an algae, a green algae that is a symbiont with these salamanders. They live on the egg membranes and on the surface of the salamander. This is a symbiosis that would be mutualistic. Not all spotted salamander eggs have this symbiont. Those that do grow faster and hatch sooner. This is the only place this algae lives. It is a specialist that is adapted to being a symbiont with salamander eggs. A third major kind of interaction within a community is some organisms want to eat others. There are predator and prey interactions. And there are adaptations within both predator and prey species. Particularly now, I want to talk about some defensive mechanisms that prey species have evolved. This caterpillar, here the green caterpillar, turns into a butterfly called the cabbage looper. So they lay their eggs on cabbages and related plants like broccoli and cauliflower and kale. And their caterpillars are very hard to see, right? Their color matches the leaf. They have a light stripe down the middle, and they'll often orient themselves parallel to a vein. This is called cryptic coloration. The caterpillars are cryptic, meaning hidden. So that's a common strategy. Blend in with the environment, keep you safe from being eaten. Some species, though, have the opposite strategy, where their coloration makes them stand out. These are poison dart frogs. They have very potent skin toxins, and they advertise that toxicity by producing very bright colorations. That's called aposematic or warning coloration, right? So, for example, if you see a flying insect with black and yellow stripes, you probably aren't going to mess with it because everybody pretty much knows that things with black and yellow stripes often have stingers. Sometimes, though, that flying insect with black and yellow stripes is actually a fly that mimics a bee or wasp, right? So mimicry is pretty common in nature, where they non-toxic or perfectly tasty and harmless organisms will have a coloration that mimics something that's toxic or venomous or has a stinger. This is called Batesian mimicry. What we see here, the butterfly on top, is a monarch, right? Monarchs are our state insect, the Illinois state insect. Monarchs are very nasty tasting because as caterpillars they eat milkweeds and they accumulate these bitter tasting toxic compounds. And when they transform into adults, they advertise that through their orange and black coloration. The picture just below, though, is a viceroy butterfly. Now, as we're sitting here looking at a still image, you can say, oh yeah, I see differences there in the number and pattern of black bars on the wing. But when they're fluttering around, birds will mistake viceroys for monarchs. Viceroys feed on willows, and they're perfectly palatable, but they are largely ignored by predators because they look like monarchs. They mimic monarchs. This is a famous animal behavior study where blue jays were hand raised from eggs. They had never seen butterflies before. This blue jay was offered a monarch, and he's like, oh good, tear the wings off, eat the body like they do. But after a few minutes, that blue jay started getting an upset stomach, and if you've never seen a bird puke, there you go, frame B, there's a vomiting blue jay. The next time that bird was offered a monarch, it refused it, and then it was offered a viceroy, and it refused it too, right? So just a simple lab demonstration of the effectiveness of mimicry. Now, caterpillars really are masters of trickery and mimicry. You might think this is two pictures of snakes, right? But the picture on the right is actually a caterpillar, where it mimics a snake, right? So it's got this expanded end with fake eyes, and predators landing on a branch might look at that and say, oh, okay, I'm not going to mess with you. Here's one more example of a caterpillar mimicry. It's very common for butterflies and other insects to, over evolutionary time, become adapted to utilizing just one kind of plant. That's the case with this butterfly called the spicebush swallowtail. It lays its eggs only on spice bushes and sassafras trees, and those trees have a lot of volatile oils in them, and their caterpillars eat that plant and they accumulate those oils and use it as a defense. They have multiple defenses. So this guy also has fake eye spots, right? So that thing that looks like an eye is just a pigment spot. The real eye is tucked way underneath there. So it's like this caterpillar is wearing a Chinese dragon costume, right? So it's got this fake head, looks like the head of a snake or something, right? So there's a close-up, right? So they're beautiful caterpillars. The bigger they get, the more convincing their mimicry is. And they have one more trick. If you mess with them, which I did, and you give them a poke, these caterpillars will extend this organ that looks like a forked tongue, and it's coated with the oils from the plant that it's accumulated. So not only do you get this flash of yellow, but you get this burst of smell, right? So it's like a visual and olfactory surprise that may be enough to ward off a predator. So speaking of surprise behaviors, my last slide in this short presentation about communities is about a snake species called the eastern hognose. And they have a very interesting set of defensive behaviors. If you find one of these snakes and you harass it or you surprise it, it's liable to pull out one of several tricks. What it may do is flatten its head out and hiss and strike at you, but it does so with its mouth closed. But if you keep messing with it, it will roll over and play dead. And it is very convincing. Look at that guy. His tongue's hanging out. He's emptied his bowels. He looks pretty dead to me. And surprisingly, a lot of predators they don't want to mess with dead stuff. I have a short video about the hognose. I'll post that separately on YouTube. It's kind of amusing. All right, we'll come back in our next presentation, talk about ecosystems.